Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, the rules are simple. Find somewhere comfortable. Pull whatever blanket is nearest. Turn the lights down to the level where you can still technically see but have made a reasonable commitment to not doing anything useful for the next while. Tonight we're drifting back to ancient Rome. Not the Rome of gladiators and burning buildings, though we'll brush past both of those at various points. Not the Rome of military campaigns and senatorial intrigue, though that's going to come up too, because in Rome it always came up. Tonight we're going to the quieter, stranger, more socially uncomfortable Rome. The Rome that had very specific opinions about what women were supposed to do with their lives, and very specific legal, social, and occasionally physical consequences for women who declined to cooperate. Tonight's topic is women who refused to marry in ancient Rome, or tried to, or succeeded for a while, before Rome noticed and did something about it. Because Rome had feelings about this. Deep, legislative, surprisingly personal feelings. The Roman state took the failure of its female citizens to reproduce with a gravity that modern observers find both baffling and, on reflection, extremely recognizable. We're going to meet Vestal Virgins who were the most legally powerful women in the Roman world and could also be buried alive if they made one wrong decision. We're going to meet aristocratic women who used celibacy as a political tool and made enemies in very high places. We're going to meet the laws that specifically targeted unmarried women's right to inherit property, because Rome was not above legislating at the uterus in very direct terms. And we're going to do all of this slowly, gently, in the way that history moves when you stop rushing it. So settle in. The lamp oil is burning low. Rome is waiting. To understand what happened to women who refused to marry in ancient Rome, you first need to understand what Rome expected of women who did marry. And the honest answer is everything. The Roman ideal of femininity was encapsulated in a phrase that appeared on more than one aristocratic woman's funeral inscription, sometimes as the entirety of her memorial. Domum servavit, lanum fecit. She kept the house. She made wool. That was it. That was the pinnacle. A Roman woman of the citizen class was expected to marry, to produce children, to manage the domestic sphere with competence and frugality, and to be essentially invisible in public life. She was not expected to have political opinions, though many of them did. She was not expected to conduct business, though many of them did. She was not expected to appear in court, though the law occasionally required it of her. And she was absolutely, fundamentally, institutionally expected to marry. Marriage in Rome was not a sacrament. Rome didn't have that concept, at least not in the way medieval Christianity would later develop it. Marriage was a social and legal institution, regulated by custom and law, and it served several clearly understood purposes. It produced legitimate children who could inherit property and continue the family line. It created alliances between families. It provided a framework for the transfer of property across generations. And it kept women, legally and practically, under the supervision of a man. This last point is important for tonight's story, because the supervision of women was something Rome took seriously in ways that ranged from the genuinely protective to the genuinely alarming, sometimes in the same legal provision. The legal framework governing Roman women's lives was built around a concept called tutela, guardianship. Under the early Roman legal tradition, a woman was never entirely her own legal person. Before marriage, she was under the guardianship of her father, or if her father was dead, of the nearest male relative. After marriage, depending on the form of marriage contracted, she might pass into the legal guardianship of her husband or remain under her father's guardianship, which sounds slightly less bad but was structurally similar. The guardian, the tutor, had to consent to any significant legal transaction his ward undertook. She could not sell property, make contracts, or take legal action without his involvement. She could not make a will without his consent, which is the kind of thing that concentrates the mind wonderfully when you're thinking about what happens to your assets. In practice, the tutela system became progressively more nominal over the centuries of the Republic and Empire. By the late Republic, a woman with enough social standing and personal assertiveness could often manage her tutor into compliance with what she wanted. By the early Empire, certain categories of women were exempt from tutela requirements entirely. But the framework existed. It was the architecture of the system. And the question of what happened to a woman who never married is, in part, a question about what happened to a woman who remained under a guardian rather than transitioning to a husband. The answer is, she stayed where she was, which was not necessarily the comfortable position it might sound like. Let's talk about why Rome was so invested in women marrying. Because it wasn't just tradition, though tradition was doing a lot of work. Rome was, for most of its history, a city and then an empire in active demographic tension. Wars took men. Plagues took everyone. The aristocratic classes in particular had a persistent problem with producing enough legitimate heirs to keep family lines going and property consolidated. This was not a theoretical concern. The great aristocratic families of the Republic died out at a remarkable rate. Families that had been politically central for generations simply ran out of male heirs, or produced only daughters, or produced children who died in infancy, or produced children who turned out to be unable or unwilling to continue the biological project that the family's continuation required. And the property question was inseparable from the children question. Roman law had developed sophisticated mechanisms for inheritance, adoption, and the transfer of property across generations. But all of those mechanisms assumed the existence of people to inherit. A woman who did not marry and did not produce children created a dead end in the inheritance chain that the law found troubling. It found it troubling enough to do something about. The laws most directly relevant to tonight's story are the Julian and Papian laws, passed in 18 BCE and 9 CE respectively, under the Emperor Augustus. Augustus had strong feelings about Roman demographic decline. He had strong feelings about most things, which is part of what made him Augustus rather than just Gaius Octavius, but the demographic question was particularly close to his policy heart. The Julian and Papian laws were a package of legislation designed to encourage marriage and childbearing among the Roman citizen classes, and to penalize those who failed to participate. The basic framework was this. Men who were unmarried between the ages of 25 and 60 were penalized in their ability to inherit from people outside their immediate family. Women who were unmarried between the ages of 20 and 50 faced the same restrictions. Women who were married but childless were also penalized, though somewhat less severely. Women who had produced 3 children, the ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children, were specifically rewarded with freedom from tutela requirements. They could act as their own legal persons. 3 children. That was the threshold. Produce 3 children and the law released you from the supervisory framework that had governed your entire adult life. The incentive structure was not subtle. The Augustan laws had a quality that legal historians describe as optimistic. They were designed to change behavior through financial incentive and disincentive, which is a perfectly reasonable legislative approach, and which failed in this case with a thoroughness that Augustus found deeply personally frustrating. The Roman aristocracy did not dramatically increase its birth rate in response to the laws. They mostly found ways around them. The most common workaround for the inheritance penalties was nominal betrothal. A woman who was technically betrothed to someone counted, under certain interpretations of the law, as being on her way to being married, and therefore not subject to the full penalty. Betrothals could be maintained, in theory, almost indefinitely. A woman could be technically betrothed and never actually marry, cycling through nominal engagements that satisfied the letter of the law without producing any of the children the law was designed to generate. The Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor and a man with approximately as much patience for legal creativity as you would expect from someone who governed through terror, eventually cracked down on this particular workaround. He limited the period during which a betrothal could exempt a woman from the inheritance penalties. So the aristocracy found different workarounds. They were, in this as in most things, persistent. Let's drift away from the law for a moment and into the actual lives of women who, for various reasons, remained unmarried in Rome. Because the legal picture is only part of the story. The social picture is more varied, more human, and in some ways more interesting. Roman society had several recognized categories of unmarried women, each with different social status, legal standing, and practical experience. There were the Vestals, the most famous and legally distinctive category, who were required to be unmarried and whose unmarried status gave them extraordinary powers. There were widows, women who had been married and whose husbands had died, and who had varying degrees of interest in marrying again. There were women who had been divorced and were between marriages. There were unmarried women in households who had simply not yet married, usually because the right arrangement hadn't been made. And then there were women who actively, deliberately, sometimes defiantly did not wish to marry. That last category is the one that Rome found most difficult. Not just legally difficult, conceptually difficult, because a woman who didn't want to marry was, from Rome's perspective, a woman who didn't understand what she was for. The Roman philosophical tradition had things to say about women and marriage, and most of what it said was not encouraging for women who preferred solitude. The Stoics, who were among the more thoughtful of the Roman philosophical schools, had a reasonably coherent position on women's rationality and capacity for virtue. They held that women were capable of reason and virtue, that the good life was available to women as to men, and that the philosophical project was not fundamentally gendered. This sounds progressive. It was, relatively speaking. But even the Stoics generally assumed that the philosophical woman would pursue virtue within the framework of marriage and family. The Stoic ideal of the good woman was the woman who managed her household with rational efficiency, raised her children with philosophical principle, and supported her husband's public life with quiet competence. Not the woman who didn't have a household. Not the woman who had declined to acquire a husband. The Epicureans, Rome's other major philosophical school, had a more interesting relationship with the question of marriage. Epicurus himself had been ambivalent about marriage, noting that the philosopher could live simply and find pleasure in friendship and contemplation without the complications that domestic life inevitably introduced. This position was occasionally cited by Romans who wanted a philosophical justification for avoiding marriage, and it was generally met with the kind of skepticism that the Epicurean school attracted from Roman traditionalists, which was a lot. Let's talk about what actually happened, practically, to an unmarried Roman woman of the citizen class who was not a Vestal. If she was young and from a good family, her situation was primarily one of anticipation. She was expected to marry, the arrangements were being made, and her unmarried state was understood as temporary. If she was a widow, her situation was more complicated and more varied. Widows had some legal advantages. A widow who had been freed from her husband's household, who had her dowry returned or accessible, who had the social standing that a respectable marriage and widowhood conferred, was in some ways the most legally and practically free position available to a Roman woman outside the Vestals. Many Roman widows were in no hurry to remarry. The law, as we've noted, had opinions about this. The Augustan legislation penalized childless widows in their inheritance rights if they remained unmarried past a certain age. A widow under 50 who did not remarry within a specified period of her husband's death faced the inheritance penalties. But a widow who had already produced 3 children had the ius trium liberorum and was exempt from the tutela requirements. She could manage her own property. She could make her own decisions. For such a woman, remarriage offered complications without obvious advantages. She was already legally free. She already had children to inherit her estate. A new husband would, depending on the form of marriage contracted, bring new complications about property and authority. Many of them simply didn't bother. The Roman literary record has interesting things to say about widows who declined to remarry. Pliny the Younger, whose letters are one of the great documentary sources for the social life of the early empire, writes with evident admiration about several women in his circle who managed their affairs with competence and independence. His letters describe women who conducted their own business dealings, who managed estates, who had opinions about philosophy and literature, who were clearly active participants in the social and intellectual life of their class. Some of these women were married. Some were widows. The widows among them are not described as social problems or objects of concern. They are described as capable, intelligent, well-organized people. Pliny's Rome, the Rome of the early 2nd century, was a Rome in which upper-class women had considerably more practical freedom than the legal framework might suggest. The tutela system, by Pliny's time, was largely a formality for women of the propertied classes. The inheritance penalties of the Augustan laws were enforced unevenly. The social pressure to remarry after widowhood, while real, was not absolute. A wealthy widow with grown children and competent management of her estates could live a reasonably autonomous life. She just had to have been married first. She had to have done her part. The women who had never married at all were a different matter. The woman who had never married, who remained in her father's household into adulthood and declined or was unable to make a match, occupied an uncomfortable social position. She was not a widow, with a widow's social credentials and resources. She was not a Vestal, with a Vestal's legal status and institutional protection. She was just there. In her father's house, or after her father's death, in whatever household had taken her in. She was, in Roman social terms, incomplete. Not quite a full person in the social sense, because the social machinery for producing a full female person went through marriage and children, and she had not passed through it. She might have many practical skills. She might be intelligent, capable, economically useful to the household that kept her. She might have close relationships and genuine affection from the people around her. But in the formal social accounting, she was a loose end, a woman who had not been placed. And Rome was not comfortable with unplaced things. Let's talk about the Vestals. Because any discussion of unmarried women in Rome that doesn't center the Vestal Virgins is missing the single most important institution in the whole story. The Vestal Virgins were the 6 priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and home. They tended the sacred flame in the circular temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, a flame that was understood to be connected to the fate of Rome itself. If the flame went out, something had gone wrong. Something religious, something political, something cosmic. The flame was not allowed to go out, and the Vestals, whose ritual duties included keeping it burning, occupied a position in Roman religious and civic life that was unlike anything else available to a Roman woman. They were among the most powerful people in Rome. Not metaphorically, actually. Let's go through the specifics, because they are remarkable. A Vestal was selected between the ages of 6 and 10. She served for 30 years. During those 30 years, she was required to remain a virgin. After 30 years, she was free to leave the college, return to secular life, and yes, marry if she chose to. Most of them didn't. By the time 30 years had passed, a Vestal was in her late 30s or 40s, well past the age Rome considered optimal for first marriages, embedded in a community and a role that had structured her entire adult life. Most of them stayed. But the legal and civic privileges they held during those 30 years were extraordinary. A Vestal was free from the tutela requirement. She had no guardian. She was a fully independent legal person. She could own property in her own name. She could make a will without male consent. She could appear in court. She could conduct her own financial transactions. She could free a slave simply by touching them if she encountered them on the road, a power that was simultaneously a legal reality and a remarkable display of the kind of authority that attached to the Vestals as an institution. Her testimony in court was accepted without oath, because a Vestal did not lie. Or rather, it was institutionally assumed that a Vestal did not lie, which for legal purposes amounted to the same thing. The Vestals had reserved seats at public games and spectacles, in the front, near the action, the best possible positions. They could intercede for condemned prisoners, and the intercession of a Vestal could result in a pardon. Magistrates encountered on the street lowered their fasces, the bundles of rods that were the symbol of their authority, in acknowledgment of a Vestal's rank. She was, in summary, treated with a deference and accorded a legal status that no other woman in Rome possessed. The price was virginity, and 30 years of service, and the persistent background awareness of what happened to Vestals who failed to maintain the required chastity. The punishment for a Vestal who was found guilty of unchastity was burial alive. Let's sit with that for a moment, because it is, even by the standards of Roman punishment, which were robust, a striking choice. The method was specific. The condemned Vestal was carried through the streets in a litter, mourned as though already dead, to a small underground chamber near the Colline Gate. The chamber was furnished with minimal provisions: a lamp, a small amount of food and water, a bed. The Vestal was placed inside. The chamber was sealed. Rome could tell itself it had not executed her. It had merely placed her somewhere and sealed the entrance. The theological reasoning was that a Vestal's person was sacred and could not be directly violated, even in punishment. Killing her outright would pollute the executioner. Burying her alive allowed her to die without anyone's hands being on her. This is the kind of legal and theological distinction that tells you a great deal about how Roman institutions managed to do terrible things while maintaining a clear conscience. The punishment was not invoked often. Over the 700-odd years of the Vestal institution, we have records of perhaps 20 or so Vestals being tried for unchastity and executed. But it was always there. The background condition. The thing that made the Vestal's extraordinary privileges legible to Roman society. She had traded the ordinary risks of female life for extraordinary powers, but the extraordinary powers came with the possibility of an extraordinary end. It's worth noting that accusations of unchastity against Vestals were not always about unchastity. Rome had learned, fairly early in its political history, that accusing a Vestal of violating her vows was an extremely effective way of destabilizing the political establishment of the moment. A Vestal's alleged lover was implicated along with her. The men accused in connection with Vestal trials were often prominent senators or political figures. The accusation served double duty. It attacked the religious integrity that was so important to Roman public life, and it destroyed specific political careers in the process. Several Vestal trials that the ancient sources record look, to modern historians, suspiciously like political prosecutions with a religious frame. The Vestal died. Her supposed lover died. The political opponent who had orchestrated the accusation consolidated their position. Justice was served. Or something was served, Anyway, the women at the center of these cases, whether guilty or innocent, were caught in political machinery that used them as instruments and discarded them when the purpose was accomplished. Which is, as we will see throughout tonight's story, a recurring pattern in the relationship between Roman institutions and Roman women. Let's drift away from the institutional Vestals and toward some individual women whose relationship with marriage was more personally motivated. Because the Vestals are the obvious case, the institutionally sanctioned and officially celebrated form of female celibacy in Rome. But they were not the only women who found themselves unmarried and trying to navigate what that meant. Rome had a philosophical tradition, as we noted, that was ambivalent about marriage at best. And that tradition produced women who absorbed its arguments and applied them to their own lives. The Stoic and Epicurean philosophical schools both attracted female students and practitioners in Rome, more than is often acknowledged. We know about several Roman women who were seriously philosophically engaged, who corresponded with philosophers, who studied philosophical texts, who participated in the intellectual life of their time in ways that went beyond the decorative patronage that aristocratic women were expected to offer. Some of these women were married. Quite a few of them were. Philosophy and marriage were not mutually exclusive, and many philosophically minded Roman women found ways to pursue their intellectual interests within the framework of domestic life. But some of them found the framework constraining in ways they were willing to say something about. And what they said when they said it was interesting. The letters of the Epicurean school in particular preserve some evidence of women who considered the question of marriage seriously and from a philosophical rather than a social angle. Epicurus himself had corresponded with women and had women among his philosophical community, which was unusual for the ancient world and which gives us some sense that the Epicurean tradition took the question of women's philosophical engagement more seriously than most. The argument that runs through Epicurean thinking about marriage is essentially a cost-benefit analysis. Marriage, in the Epicurean framework, brings obligations, complications, and sources of distress. A spouse can suffer. Children can suffer. The philosopher who is entangled in a household full of people whose well-being is dependent on them is a philosopher who is perpetually exposed to the anxiety of potential loss. The Epicurean goal is ataraxia, tranquility, freedom from disturbance. And a household is a disturbance-generating machine. This is not a misogynist argument. Exactly. Epicurus applied it to men as well, and was genuinely ambivalent about whether the philosophical life was compatible with marriage and family. But for Roman women who encountered this argument, it had a specific resonance. Because for a Roman woman, marriage was not just an emotional and logistical complication. It was a legal and social transformation that affected her property, her freedom of movement, her ability to make decisions about her own life. The Epicurean argument against marriage was, for a Roman woman, also an argument against legal absorption, against the loss of whatever autonomous space she had managed to create. Let's talk about a specific and well-documented case of a Roman woman whose relationship with marriage was complicated enough to be interesting. Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi. Cornelia is one of the most celebrated women in all of Roman history, which is not a crowded field but is still meaningful. She was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, which gave her the kind of aristocratic lineage that made Roman society automatically respectful. She married Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, a distinguished statesman. She had 12 children, of whom 3 survived to adulthood. She was widowed while still relatively young. And then she did not remarry. She had multiple suitors. The sources mention an offer from Ptolemy VIII of Egypt, which is the kind of offer that even the most committed widow might consider, since it came with a kingdom attached. She declined it. She remained a widow. She devoted herself to the education of her surviving children, Tiberius and Gaius, who grew up to be the Gracchi, the reforming tribunes whose careers ended in political violence and whose memory haunted Roman politics for generations. She was celebrated in her own lifetime and afterward. There was a statue of her in Rome, with the inscription, Cornelia, Mother of the Gracchi. The statue depicted her with her sons, not her husband, not her father. Her children were her monuments. She appears in the sources as witty, educated, politically astute, and entirely uninterested in the opinions of people who thought she should remarry. The story usually told about Cornelia involves a moment when a visitor was showing off her jewelry, and Cornelia called her sons into the room and said, pointing to them, "These are my jewels." It's a beautiful story. It's almost certainly not entirely true in its told form. Ancient anecdotes about famous women tend to be polished into parable, but it captures something real about how Cornelia was understood by Rome, as a woman whose greatness was expressed through her children rather than her remarriage, whose choice to remain a widow was legible to Roman society because it was framed as maternal devotion rather than personal preference. This is important. Cornelia's widowhood was acceptable to Rome partly because she was Cornelia, Scipio's daughter, the Gracchi's mother, a woman of such overwhelming aristocratic and civic credentials that Roman society could not easily criticize her, but also partly because her refusal to remarry was understood in terms Rome approved of. She was keeping herself for her children. She was preserving her household. She was not refusing marriage because she found it constraining, or because she preferred philosophical solitude, or because she had found any number of other ways to organize her life that she preferred. She was refusing marriage because she was a mother, and Rome understood mothers. Let's drift towards some of the less celebrated refusals. Because Cornelia had advantages that most Roman women did not. She had extraordinary family prestige. She had the moral credit of motherhood. She had the social standing to make choices that would have been condemned in women with fewer credentials. Most Roman women who preferred not to marry had none of these things. And for them, the experience was considerably less comfortable. The social pressure on unmarried women of the citizen class was maintained through a combination of legal disincentive, as we've discussed, and social stigma, which operated through the informal mechanisms of reputation, gossip, and the very specific Roman concern with what the neighbors thought. Romans were, despite their global empire and sophisticated legal system, fundamentally a small-town culture in their social instincts. The opinion of the community, the judgment of the neighborhood, the assessment of the local social network mattered enormously. A woman who declined to marry was a woman who was doing something strange. And in Rome, doing something strange was not a neutral act. It attracted attention. It generated gossip. It invited the kind of social scrutiny that could shade into social harm. The Latin language has a word, anus, which came to mean old woman and which carried, in its common usage, distinctly negative connotations. The unmarried older woman in Roman literature and popular imagination was a figure of mockery. She was described as attempting to maintain a youthful appearance past the point where such attempts were considered appropriate. She was described as pursuing romantic or sexual interests that her age made ridiculous. She was described as bitter, grasping, or socially tedious. The satirists had a field day. Horace, Juvenal, Ovid, all of them produced unflattering portraits of older women who had not settled into the respectable invisibility that Roman society considered appropriate for their stage of life. The respectable invisibility was, itself, produced by the machinery of marriage. A woman who had married, produced children, and been widowed could claim the moral authority of the matron. She had done her part. She was entitled to retire from the more active phases of social performance. A woman who had never married had no such claim. She was still, in some sense, in process, still potentially available, still subject to the social assessment that preceded the making of a match. And that assessment, in Roman eyes, became less and less flattering as the years passed. The Roman poets are not necessarily the most reliable sources for the actual lived experience of unmarried women. Satire exaggerates. Erotic poetry pursues its own agendas. The literary portrait of the older unmarried woman tells us more about male anxieties and social prejudices than it does about what it actually felt like to be an older unmarried woman in Rome. But the inscriptions are different. The epigraphic record of Rome, the thousands of tombstone inscriptions, votive dedications, and public records that survive in stone, gives us a different kind of picture. Many of these inscriptions, particularly the funerary ones, were written or commissioned by the people who loved the dead. They are not literary performances. They are personal, and in their imperfection and idiosyncrasy, they are revealing. And among the inscriptions, you find women who lived full and evidently valued lives without marriage ever being their defining feature. Freed women who built businesses and were celebrated by their communities for their competence and generosity. Women in religious roles, not just Vestals but the various other priestly functions available to women in Rome's eclectic religious landscape. Women described in terms of their relationships to female friends, female relatives, female communities, rather than through the standard marital vocabulary. These inscriptions don't tell us whether these women had refused marriage or simply never had the opportunity or simply lived in circumstances where the question was less central than it was in the aristocratic social world that the literary sources depict. But they suggest a world more varied than the legal and literary framework implies. Let's talk about a specific legal situation that produced significant numbers of effectively unmarried women in Rome, without any of those women having made an active choice in the matter. The slave population. Rome was a slave society. At various points, slaves may have constituted between 20 and 30% of the total population of Italy. The demographic and social implications of this were enormous and affected every aspect of Roman life. Enslaved women could not legally marry. Slaves were not legal persons. They could not enter into contracts. They could form relationships, have children, create families, all of which were understood to exist entirely at the discretion of the enslaver and could be dissolved at any moment. The children of enslaved women were born enslaved. The father, if enslaved, had no legal parental rights. If the father was the enslaver or another free person, the child was still enslaved. When enslaved women were freed, manumitted, they entered a complex legal status as freed women. They could now legally marry. They owed their former enslaver certain duties of service and respect. They occupied a social position below free-born citizens but above the enslaved. The experience of freedom and its relationship to marriage for manumitted women is a rich area of social history that doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. Many freed women married. The epigraphic record shows freed women forming households, making marriages, building family units. But many freed women also lived independently, running businesses, maintaining households as their own legal heads, navigating a social world that was more open to them than it had been in slavery but still structured by the assumptions we've been discussing. For freed women, the question of marriage was entangled with questions of economic survival, of social respectability, of the relationship to former enslavers who remained legally and socially significant. It was not a simple question. It was rarely a simple question for any woman in Rome. Let's drift into the early Christian period, because Christianity's arrival in Rome changed the terms of the discussion about women and marriage in ways that are directly relevant to tonight's story. Christianity arrived in Rome in the 1st century CE. It spread through the urban networks of the empire, through communities of freed people, through the households of aristocratic women who found in the new religion something that the old religious landscape wasn't offering. And one of the things early Christianity offered that was genuinely distinctive was a theological affirmation of virginity. Not just the practical celibacy of the Vestals, which was a service obligation rather than a spiritual ideal. Not just the philosophical argument against marriage as a source of disturbance. A positive theological claim that the virgin life was spiritually superior to the married life, that women who chose consecrated virginity were choosing a higher form of existence, that celibacy was not a lack but an achievement. This was new. Rome had the Vestals, certainly, but the Vestals were celibate by institutional requirement during their service, not because virginity was spiritually superior as a permanent condition. The Roman philosophical tradition had arguments against marriage, but they were essentially arguments about tranquility and the management of disturbance, not arguments about spiritual hierarchy. Christianity said something different. Christianity said that the virgin was closer to the angels, and a remarkable number of Roman women found this argument very attractive. The early Christian communities in Rome had a significant female membership. Women of various social classes, including women of the aristocracy, were among the early adopters. The reasons were multiple. Christianity offered a community of mutual support that was particularly valuable for women without strong family networks. Freed women, widows, women who had been marginalized by the mainstream social structures. Christianity offered women roles in community life that were genuinely participatory. Leadership of household churches, roles in charitable work, teaching functions in the early communities. And Christianity offered, as we've noted, a theology of virginity that made the refusal of marriage not a social failure but a spiritual vocation. This last offering was enormously significant, because it gave women who preferred not to marry a language, a framework, an institutional context in which that preference was not just tolerated but celebrated. The woman who had refused marriage in the pagan Roman context was, at best, eccentric and, at worst, a social liability. The woman who had refused marriage in the Christian context was pursuing a higher calling. She was a bride of Christ, which is, as theological reframings go, quite a transformation. The emergence of Christian virginity as a social and theological institution in Rome created what we might describe as a moderate earthquake in the city's aristocratic social fabric. Because it wasn't just poor women and freed women choosing consecrated virginity. It was daughters of senators. It was women who were supposed to marry into the great families, produce heirs, maintain the aristocratic networks that Rome's elite social world depended on. And they were, with increasing frequency in the 3rd and 4th centuries, declining to do so on religious grounds. This caused, to put it mildly, some family tension. The sources from the early Christian period are full of accounts of conflicts between parents and children over the virginity question. Fathers who had arranged marriages finding their daughters had taken private vows of virginity and intended to honor them. Mothers, occasionally, supporting daughters against fathers on this point. Brothers are interesting in these accounts. Sometimes they supported their sisters' choices, particularly if they were themselves Christians. Sometimes they were furious, because their sister's decision not to marry disrupted family alliances they were counting on. The economic and social stakes were significant. A daughter who refused to marry was a daughter whose dowry was not being deployed to create a useful alliance. She was a daughter who was not producing grandchildren. She was a daughter who was, in the eyes of the traditional Roman social calculation, simply not doing what she was for. And she had a theological argument that the law couldn't easily touch. The Roman state's response to Christian virginity as a social phenomenon was, broadly speaking, irritated confusion. The Augustan marriage laws were still technically in force, at least in their framework, though their enforcement had always been uneven and became more so over time. A woman who had taken a private vow of virginity was, in legal terms, still unmarried and therefore technically subject to the inheritance penalties. But enforcing those penalties against a woman who had chosen consecrated Christian virginity, in a period when Christianity was spreading rapidly and Christian community networks were increasingly significant, was not straightforward. The emperors of the 3rd and 4th centuries had enough problems without creating a new conflict with the Christian communities over inheritance law. And when Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century and made it the preferred religion of the empire, the calculation changed entirely. Constantine issued specific legal provisions protecting the property rights of consecrated Christian virgins. In one stroke, the women who had been penalized by the Augustan laws for remaining unmarried were, if they were Christian virgins, not just exempted from the penalties but positively protected. The theological trump card had become a legal one. Let's talk about some of the individual women of the early Christian period in Rome whose choices about marriage are documented with enough detail to be worth examining. Marcella is a good place to start. Marcella was a Roman aristocrat of the 4th century, born into a family of senatorial rank, the kind of background that automatically assumed a prestigious marriage. She married young, as was expected. Her husband died after only a few months of marriage, which was devastating personally but which also, from the perspective of Roman law and custom, left her in a position of relative autonomy. She was a young widow of good family with no children. The social machinery immediately began producing suitors. One of those suitors, the sources tell us, was the former prefect of Rome, which in terms of eligible bachelors in 4th century Rome was approximately as distinguished as it got. She declined. She told her mother, according to the account preserved by Jerome, who had personal reasons to admire her, since she was one of his most significant patrons and intellectual interlocutors, that if she had wished to marry, she would have sought a husband rather than an estate. It's a very good line. It acknowledges the financial calculus while dismissing it. It's also, we should note, a line recorded by a man who admired her and may have polished it considerably in the retelling. But the substance is real. She declined to remarry. She devoted herself to Christian study and practice, established an ascetic community in her house on the Aventine Hill, and became one of the most significant figures in the early Roman Christian intellectual movement. Jerome, who later became her spiritual director and corresponded with her extensively, found in Marcella exactly the kind of female patron and intellectual companion that he, being Jerome, needed and probably didn't entirely deserve. Their correspondence is preserved and is genuinely interesting as both intellectual history and social document. Jerome wrote to Marcella about biblical texts, about the Hebrew language, about theological controversies. She wrote back with questions and challenges that Jerome's responses suggest were pointed enough to require careful answers. She was, by all accounts, formidably well-educated and not inclined to accept answers she found unsatisfying. Jerome admired this quality, which speaks well of him, since many men of his era and temperament would have found it simply annoying. Marcella's household on the Aventine became an informal center of Christian intellectual life in Rome. Women and men came to discuss theology, to read scripture, to engage with the intellectual tradition of the new religion. It was not a convent. It was not a formally organized religious community. It was a wealthy widow's house, used according to her preferences, organized according to her values, run according to her judgment. She had, in effect, created a space that was entirely her own, something that the standard path of Roman aristocratic life, marriage and household and children, and the orbit of a husband's career, would have made considerably more difficult. The refusal to remarry had opened a space. The story of Marcella ends in 410 CE, when the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome. She was very old by then, in her 80s by some estimates. The Goths ransacked her house looking for treasure. When they found less than they expected, they beat her. She died shortly afterward. Jerome, who was in Bethlehem by this time, wrote about her death with evident grief. He described her as dying calmly, focused on the survival of the younger woman she had been sheltering, not on her own suffering. Whether this account is historically precise or hagiographically embellished is impossible to know at this distance. What we can say is that she lived the life she chose, that she made that life richly meaningful, and that she died in circumstances that were terrible in ways that had nothing to do with her choices and everything to do with the collapse of the world around her. Which is, in the end, how a lot of Roman lives ended in the 5th century. Let's talk about Melania the Elder, because she is one of the more spectacular cases of Roman aristocratic renunciation in the late antique period, and she is impossible to leave out. Melania was born around 340 CE into one of the wealthiest families in the Roman world. She married, as expected. She had children. And then, within a short period, her husband died and 2 of her 3 children died as well. She was 22 years old. She left her surviving infant son in the care of a guardian, gathered her resources, and left Rome for Egypt, to visit the desert monastics who were the spiritual celebrities of 4th century Christianity. Then she went to Jerusalem. Then she founded a double monastery on the Mount of Olives, which she ran for approximately 20 years. Then she came back to Rome, briefly, to encourage her granddaughter, also named Melania and now known as Melania the Younger, to follow a similar path. Then she went to Jerusalem again and died there. The scale of Melania the Elder's wealth, and the scale of its divestment, was extraordinary. She gave away property across 3 continents. She funded monasteries and churches and charitable institutions across the Mediterranean world. She provided for the exile and support of Nicene Christians during periods of imperial religious controversy. She paid ransoms for captives. The wealth she dispersed would, by any reasonable modern estimate, have represented a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars. She gave it away, not because she was ruined, because she chose to. The Roman aristocratic establishment's reaction to Melania's choices was mixed and in some cases vehement. Her family had arranged a marriage for her surviving son. When Melania returned to Rome in her later years, she was essentially doing a victory lap among the people who had spent decades disapproving of her. And many of them had disapproved strenuously. A Roman aristocrat of her class had responsibilities. She had networks to maintain, alliances to support, a position in the social fabric that required her ongoing participation. She had simply left. She had taken her enormous wealth and removed it from the Roman aristocratic circulation system and deployed it, as far as Roman aristocratic eyes were concerned, in the middle of the desert for incomprehensible religious reasons. The sources preserve complaints. Relatives who felt the family's social position had been compromised. Members of the senatorial class who found her example embarrassing or threatening. And underneath the specific complaints about Melania was a more general anxiety. If this was possible, if a woman of her wealth and standing could simply decide not to participate in the marriage and inheritance machinery of Roman aristocratic life, and could make that decision stick, what did that mean for the system? What it meant, it turned out, was that the system was changing. The Rome that Melania was born into and the Rome she died away from were different places, organized around different principles, with different assumptions about what a wealthy woman owed to society. She didn't single-handedly create that change, but she was very much a part of it. Let's step back for a moment from individual women and return to the law, because the law was doing interesting things in the 3rd and 4th centuries in response to the growing phenomenon of women choosing religious life over marriage. The Augustan marriage laws, which we discussed earlier, were still technically in force in various forms through the 3rd century, but they were increasingly difficult to enforce against the backdrop of a changing religious landscape. Constantine's conversion created a new legal framework for religious institutions, including provisions for women in religious communities. His successors, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, extended these protections and in some cases created new ones. By the late 4th century, the legal position of a consecrated Christian virgin was considerably better than the legal position of a randomly unmarried pagan woman had been under Augustus. She was exempt from the tutela requirements in many jurisdictions. She had rights over her own property. She could make a will. She was, in the eyes of the law, increasingly treated as something like the Vestal Virgin, a woman whose celibacy was socially recognized and legally accommodated. The comparison is imperfect, because the Vestal institution was a specific civic role with specific powers attached, and consecrated Christian virginity was a more dispersed phenomenon. But the structural parallel is real. Rome had, essentially, updated the category. The woman who refused to marry now had, if she expressed that refusal in Christian terms, a legal framework that protected her choice rather than penalizing it. This didn't mean the social pressure evaporated. Families continued to have feelings about daughters who chose religious virginity over marriage. The complaints of Jerome, Ambrose, and other early Christian writers about families pressuring their daughters to marry suggest that the pressure was real and persistent throughout the late antique period. Jerome in particular wrote with considerable heat about fathers who sabotaged their daughters' religious vocations by dangling attractive marriage offers, about mothers who were seduced by the prospect of grandchildren into discouraging religious life, about family pressure that wore down women who had initially been determined. His letters to Eustochium, the daughter of his patron Paula, are essentially a long manual for how to resist all of this pressure. They are also, it should be said, fairly aggressive documents that tell a young woman to think of her family's bodies as corrupted flesh, which is the kind of advice that gives modern readers pause. Jerome was not always helpful, but the underlying reality his letters describe is real. Women who wanted to choose religious virginity often had to fight for that choice against families who had other plans. Let's talk about what the refusal to marry cost women who were not aristocrats. Because the aristocratic cases are the ones that dominate the historical record. They generated letters and inscriptions and hagiographical accounts because the people involved were important enough that their choices mattered to the historical institutions doing the recording. But Roman society was not made up of aristocrats. It was made up of merchants and craftspeople and farmers and soldiers and freed people and enslaved people and the enormous middle range of people who occupied the space between senatorial luxury and grinding poverty. For women in this middle range, the question of marriage was less about legal independence and inherited wealth and more about survival. A craftsman's widow who did not remarry was a craftsman's widow who needed to either take over the business, find another way to generate income, or depend on the charity of family members. Some of them took over the business. The epigraphic record shows women running workshops, managing shops, conducting trade. Some of them found community support through the religious institutions that were, by the 3rd and 4th centuries, increasingly organized for exactly this kind of social welfare. Early Christian communities specifically prioritized the care of widows. The widow, in Christian social thinking, was a figure who deserved communal support and who could, in return, offer the community certain services: prayer, teaching, care for the sick. The Order of Widows in early Christian communities was a recognized institution. Women who had been married, who had been widowed, who were being maintained by the community, and who filled certain community functions in return. This was not exactly the same as the aristocratic virginity we've been discussing, but it was another form of institutionalized female life outside of marriage, and it served real social functions. Let's drift into a few specific stories that illuminate the experience of ordinary women navigating these questions. The Egyptian papyri, the enormous archive of documents that survive from Roman Egypt on dry papyrus, give us a view of ordinary Roman provincial life that the literary sources don't provide. Among the papyri are documents relating to marriage, divorce, property, and inheritance. They include contracts between private individuals that show how the legal and social frameworks we've been discussing actually played out at the level of everyday life. And among them are documents that suggest women making strategic choices about their legal status in ways that served their own interests. A widow who remarried sometimes specified in the new marriage contract terms that preserved her independent control over the property she had brought from her first marriage. A woman who remained unmarried sometimes made formal legal arrangements to protect her property from claims by relatives. A freedwoman establishing a business sometimes structured her legal position carefully to maximize her autonomy. These documents don't tell us what these women thought about marriage or celibacy in any philosophical sense. They tell us what they did. The decisions, the arrangements, the practical navigation of a system that wasn't designed for their benefit. It's a different kind of history than the literary accounts of aristocratic women. Less eloquent, more immediate, and in some ways more illuminating about what was actually at stake. Let's bring together the various strands we've been following and answer the specific question that we set out tonight to explore. What happened to women who refused to marry in ancient Rome? The answer, as with most genuinely historical answers, is, it depended. It depended on when in Roman history. In the early Republic, the social and legal pressure was intense and the options were limited. A woman who did not marry remained under her father's guardianship indefinitely, managed whatever property came to her under the supervision of a male tutor, and occupied a socially awkward position that Roman community life had not really made space for. She might be respected. She might be economically competent. She might build a life that was meaningful to her and to the people around her. But she was swimming against the current of a social system that had not built a channel for her. In the late Republic and early Empire, the Augustan laws added a new layer of legal disincentive. The inheritance penalties that reduced an unmarried woman's ability to benefit from the wills of people outside her immediate family. But the same period saw the beginning of a more relaxed practical approach to tutela, with guardians increasingly becoming nominal. And wealthy widows in particular found ways to manage their independence. The key variable was resources. Always resources. A wealthy woman had options. She had legal advocates, social connections, the moral authority that Roman society extended to aristocratic women who had already fulfilled their primary obligations. A poor woman had fewer options. She depended more directly on family or community or the charity of institutions. In the late antique period, from the 3rd century onward, Christianity transformed the landscape. Consecrated virginity gave women who chose it a theological framework, an institutional community, and eventually a legal status that made the refusal of marriage not just tolerable but admirable. This was genuinely new, and it changed the answer to our question in important ways. A woman who refused to marry in pagan Rome was defying social convention, breaching her legal obligations under the Augustan legislation, and inviting the gossip and disapproval of her community. A woman who refused to marry as a consecrated Christian virgin was fulfilling a higher calling, joining a recognized and increasingly prestigious institution, and potentially accessing legal protections that her pagan counterpart didn't have. She might still face family opposition. She might still experience social friction. The transition from one world to the other was not instant or complete, but the direction of travel had changed. What didn't change, throughout all the periods we've discussed, was the fundamental social assumption that women's primary purpose was reproduction. The Augustan laws expressed it in fiscal terms. The Roman satirists expressed it in mockery. The early Christian writers who celebrated virginity still worked within a framework that understood women primarily in terms of their sexual status. Virgin, wife, widow. The categories were relational. The definitions were biological and social. The woman who refused to marry was always, in some sense, being measured against the template of the woman who did. And that template, the wife and mother, the keeper of the house and maker of wool, was always there. Sometimes the measurement was harsh. Sometimes it was generous. But it was always happening. Let's talk about one more woman before we let tonight's story begin to settle. Hypatia of Alexandria. Hypatia is not, technically, a Roman woman in the narrow sense. She was a Greek-speaking philosopher in Roman Alexandria in the early 5th century. But she is too relevant to tonight's topic to omit. Hypatia was the daughter of the mathematician Theon. She was educated by him and became a mathematician and philosopher of considerable reputation herself. She lectured. She taught. She attracted students from across the Mediterranean world. She never married. The sources don't give us a direct account of her thoughts on the matter. What we have are accounts from admirers that emphasize her dedication to philosophy and her indifference to the distractions that marriage would have introduced. One account, probably apocryphal but too vivid to leave out, describes a student who had developed an attachment to her, expressing his feelings in the direct way that ancient sources describe men expressing feelings to philosophers. She is said to have produced a piece of cloth she was wearing during her menstruation and presented it to him, saying, "This is what you desire, and it is not beautiful." True or not, the story tells you what tradition thought Hypatia was like. Someone whose relationship to her body and its social implications was thoroughly philosophical rather than conventional. She died in 415 CE, murdered by a Christian mob in Alexandria, in a killing that was political as much as religious, that reflected the violent tensions of 5th century Alexandria rather than any objection to her unmarried state. She is remembered as a martyr to philosophy, to paganism, to female intellectual life. She is not the last woman in history to be destroyed by a situation she didn't create and a conflict she wasn't the real target of. The world we've been moving through tonight doesn't end neatly. History doesn't do that. But Roman civilization, in its recognizable form, did undergo the transformation that historians call the fall of the Western Empire, the process by which the administrative, military, and cultural structures that had organized the Mediterranean world for centuries fragmented and reformed into something new. That transformation changed the context in which women made choices about marriage. Medieval Christian Europe inherited certain elements of the Roman legal tradition, including modified versions of the property law and elements of the tutela concept. It inherited the Christian theology of virginity, which had become enormously more elaborate and institutionalized in the intervening centuries. The monastery and the convent were the developed institutional expressions of the late antique virginity movement, and they provided the major alternative to marriage that medieval women had access to. It inherited the social assumption that women's primary purpose was reproduction within marriage. And it inherited the tension between these things, the assumption of marriage and the available alternative of the religious life, pulling in different directions at the center of women's experience for another 1,000 years. We'll save that for another night. But let's end tonight where we began, with the question of what happened to women who refused to marry in Rome. Some of them were pressured into compliance. The social and legal machinery of Rome was extensive and effective, and women without resources or social standing had little capacity to resist it. Some of them found the widow's position, which offered a degree of autonomy that Roman law and custom made available to women who had done their duty and lost their husbands, and settled into it with evident relief. Some of them were Vestals, who traded the married life for 30 years of extraordinary power and the permanent background possibility of being buried alive. Some of them were philosophical, absorbing the Stoic and Epicurean arguments about tranquility and applying them to the question of whether to acquire a husband. Some of them were Christian, finding in the theology of consecrated virginity a framework that made their refusal not just acceptable but praiseworthy. Some of them were Hypatia, dedicating themselves to something they found more important than anything the marriage market was offering. And some of them, inevitably, are names we don't have, women who made choices that left no record because the recording institutions weren't interested in them. They lived their lives. They navigated their situations. They found whatever spaces the system made available and, in some cases, made a little extra space where there hadn't been any. Most of history is them. Let's drift into the final stretch of tonight's story, the part that is, by its nature, the hardest to tell. Because we've been talking, for most of this evening, about women who left traces. Cornelia left traces because her sons were famous. Marcella left traces because Jerome wrote about her. Melania left traces because her granddaughter's biographer wrote about her and because the scale of her wealth made her impossible to ignore. Hypatia left traces because she was murdered publicly and her death became a symbol. But for every Cornelia and every Marcella, there were thousands of women whose choices about marriage left no trace in the historical record. The merchant's daughter who simply never found a match that suited her family and lived in her brother's household for the rest of her life, managing his children and his domestic affairs, useful and invisible. The freedwoman who built a small business, maintained herself, and had no particular interest in the legal complications that marriage would introduce into her financial arrangements. The woman in a cult of one of Rome's many foreign religions, Isis or Cybele or Mithras, whose religious commitment provided a community and a purpose that she found more compelling than the domestic alternative. The woman who simply, quietly, didn't. And no one wrote about her. And no inscription was made. And the details of her life, what she thought, what she wanted, what she found meaningful, are simply gone. This is, as we've noted before on this channel, one of the fundamental conditions of doing history. Most of it is silence. What we have is the edge of the silence, the places where the silence has a shape, where the absence of a record is itself a kind of evidence. The woman who doesn't appear in the marriage records. The household that doesn't produce a wife's inscription alongside the husband's. The property that passes between sisters rather than from parent to child through marriage. These are the traces of lives that the archive didn't bother to capture. Let me tell you about the Roman concept of univira. The univira, the one-man woman, was a woman who had been married once and not remarried after her husband's death. She was celebrated. Inscriptions praised her for it. It was considered a virtue, which is interesting because it exists in some tension with the Augustan legislation that penalized widows who didn't remarry. Rome contained multitudes. It had a law that pushed women toward remarriage and a social ideal that celebrated women who didn't remarry. These two things coexisted, in the way that contradictory social expectations often do, by applying to different contexts. The law applied to women in their reproductive years, who the state wanted producing children. The ideal of the univira applied to women past their reproductive prime, or to women of such standing that their social prestige made the fertility calculation secondary. There was a window in which the contradiction was most acute. The widow who was still young enough to bear children but who had fulfilled enough of her social obligations to claim some moral authority. How that window resolved for individual women depended on everything we've discussed: class, resources, family connections, personal determination, and the specific configuration of social pressure they were navigating. There's a quality to Roman women's history that I find, at this late hour, quietly moving. Not because it's sad, though parts of it are. Not because it's triumphant, though parts of it are that too. But because it is so thoroughly human in its mess and contradiction and the gap between what the system said and what people actually did. Rome said, "Marry," and some women married, and some women found ways not to. And some women married and then became widows and then discovered that widowhood, for all its legal limitations, offered something marriage hadn't. And some women were Vestals and were the most powerful people in Rome and also could be buried alive. And some women were Melania, giving away an empire's worth of money in the desert in pursuit of something the people around them found baffling. And some women were Hypatia, teaching mathematics to students who crossed the Mediterranean to learn from her. And some women were the ones we don't know about, making their quiet arrangements, building their quiet lives, in the spaces the system left between its categories. All of them were there. All of them were navigating. All of them were making it work, or trying to, with what they had. Let's let the story unwind with a few more figures, kept deliberately gentle and calm, because we're in the late hours now and the detail can soften. Sulpicia. There were 2 Roman women named Sulpicia whose work survives, which is both remarkable and a useful reminder that when people say there are no women in Roman literature, they are slightly overstating it, though only slightly. The first Sulpicia, whose love poems survive embedded in a collection, is one of the very few female Roman poets whose work we have directly. The poems are short, personal, and refreshingly direct about the experience of being in love. She was, by the time the poems were written, presumably still young and presumably still unmarried, since the poems read as those of someone in the passionate and uncertain phases of romantic experience rather than the settled phases of domestic life. Whether she eventually married, we don't know. The poems are all we have. But she wrote them, and they survived, and we have them, which means that in the vast silence of the Roman record, Sulpicia is one of the few women speaking in her own voice about her own experience. That's worth something. Fannia. Fannia appears in Pliny the Younger's letters, and she is one of the figures he treats with evident warmth and respect. She was twice exiled from Rome for political reasons connected to the Stoic opposition to various emperors. Her first husband had also been exiled for similar reasons. Her father before him. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable political courage who had absorbed the philosophical and political commitments of a family that took both seriously enough to suffer for them. She was widowed. The record doesn't tell us whether she remarried after her husband's death and exile. What Pliny's letters tell us is that she was ill when he wrote about her, that he was worried for her, and that her loss would be felt as a significant one by the community of educated people he moved in. She was valued not as a wife, not as a mother, not in terms of her reproductive utility to the Roman state. She was valued as a person, which is, in the context of all the legal and social machinery we've been discussing tonight, something worth noting. Perpetua. Vibia Perpetua was a young Christian woman of Carthage, in North Africa, martyred in 203 CE. She left a diary, a prison diary, written during her imprisonment before her death. It is one of the only first-person documents written by a woman that survives from the ancient world. Perpetua was married, or had been married, and had an infant son when she was arrested. The diary describes visits from her father, pleading with her to renounce her faith and save herself. It describes her grief about leaving her infant. It describes her visions, which are vivid and strange and clearly meant seriously. She is not exactly tonight's topic. She didn't refuse to marry. She was a married woman who had already done the things Rome expected of her. But she chose something else over everything Rome had offered her. Her faith, her vision, whatever it was she understood herself to be doing. She walked into the arena. She was 22 years old. Her diary is extraordinary because it is hers. Because she wrote it. Because whatever happened afterward, and what happened was her death, the words are there, in her voice, from inside her experience. Most of the women we've discussed tonight are known through other people's accounts. Jerome's admiring letters, Pliny's warm observations, the formal inscriptions that record lives in conventional phrases. Perpetua speaks directly. I find this, at this late hour, quietly astonishing. That she is there. That we have her. That the document survived. We've been here for a while now. The candle, metaphorically speaking, is very low. We've moved from the Roman marriage laws and their elaborate financial penalties to the Vestal Virgins and their extraordinary powers. We've met Cornelia and her jewels, Marcella and her Aventine house, Melania and her desert money, Hypatia and her mathematics. We've traced the slow transformation of the legal and social landscape from the pagan republic through the Christian empire, watching the category of acceptable female celibacy expand from the narrow and precarious Vestal institution to the broad and eventually legally protected world of consecrated Christian virginity. And we've noted, throughout, the women we couldn't trace. The ones who left no record. The ones whose choices are visible only in the shape of their absence. What does Rome's story tell us about what happened to women who refused to marry? It tells us that the system was designed to make it difficult. It tells us that difficulty was not always sufficient deterrent. It tells us that the women who managed it most successfully were usually the women with the most resources, the most social standing, the most institutional support. It tells us that some of them found institutional frameworks, the Vestal institution, the later Christian communities, that made their choices not just tolerable but celebrated. It tells us that the same social system that penalized them also, in certain moments and contexts, found ways to admire them. Which is, in the end, how social systems tend to work. They contain their own contradictions. They produce the pressure and occasionally, at the edges, make space for what they're pressuring against. Rome was very good at containing multitudes. Even the multitudes it was officially trying to suppress. Let the story soften now. The legal documents can be folded back into their archives. The Vestals are at their flame, which is burning steadily. Cornelia is at her writing table, surrounded by her son's correspondence. Marcella is in her Aventine house, asking Jerome a question he's not entirely sure how to answer. Melania is in the desert, giving something away. Hypatia is at her lectern, explaining a mathematical problem to a student who has come a very long way to hear it. And somewhere in the city, in the thousands of ordinary houses that the literary record doesn't bother to describe, the women we don't know are doing what they've been doing all day. Managing, thinking, choosing within whatever space the system made available, and occasionally just past the edge of it. Being there. Stubbornly, quietly, completely there. The night is very deep now. Rome, in all its noisy, complicated, brilliantly awful glory, is asleep around them. The flame in the temple is burning. The papyrus is rolled and tied. The lamp is out. Good night. Or good morning, wherever you are in the night. The women of Rome have been here the whole time. They were always here. They simply didn't always get written down. That's enough for tonight. That's, in fact, quite a lot.